psychedelics helped me to escape, albeit momentarily, from the prison of my mind. They provided glimpses of the possibility that there was something beyond the persona. Ram Dass, Be Here Now. They are found in almost every society and culture. They range from natural compounds like psilocybin and ayahuasca to synthesized products like LSD. They even include practices like smoking the toad. Smoking the toad refers to the inhalation of vaporized venom from the Bufo alvarius toad. This toad secretes a venom rich in 5-MeO-DMT, an extremely potent psychoactive compound. When smoked, it induces an intense, short-lived psychedelic experience, often described as deeply transformative, even mystical. Mostly, however, it is best known for its reputed ability to dissolve the egoic self. Many indigenous shamanistic cultures often combine psychedelics and spiritual practices to bring about such ego-dissolution. There are also Eastern spiritual traditions known for their ego-dissolving practices, among them Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. In Buddhism, the ego, or anatta, is perceived as an illusion and as the primary barrier to enlightenment. Similarly, in Advaita Vedanta, a branch of Hindu philosophy, the dissolution of ahamkara, ego sense, is essential for realizing the true self, or Atman. Can a psychedelic experience bring about a permanent dissolution of the ego, or is a spiritual practice or insight of some kind necessary? If you are enjoying this video on psychedelics, spiritual practice, and awakening, you may like to further your interests at our online bookstore, Asangaham Books. There you will find not only books on spirituality and philosophy, but also a curated list of the greatest books on psychedelics. You can find the link to our bookstore in the description. Thanks. The history of psychedelics is as diverse as the cultures that have embraced them. These substances, mostly derived from plants, have played an important role in indigenous shamanic practices. In the Amazon basin, shamans have long used ayahuasca, made from Banisteriopsis carpi, for both spiritual and healing purposes. In North America, peyote, a cactus plant containing mescaline, is protected under U.S. law as a religious sacrament for use in the Native American Church. The use of these psychoactive plants is not merely about altered consciousness. They are part of both healing practices and spiritual guidance. In the West during the 1960s, the use and perception of psychedelics underwent a dramatic transformation. Substances like LSD and psilocybin mushrooms moved from the scientific lab to use among the youth and symbols of the counterculture. Most importantly, they became tools for spiritual exploration outside traditional religious frameworks. Along with the use of psychedelics came a surge of interest in Eastern spirituality. And it was psychedelics that often provided the real experience that helped one to understand the mystical states that were being pointed to in Eastern spiritual practices. The use of psychedelics can result in a wide range of extreme experiences. One might experience altered perception, intensified colors, and sensory distortions of all kinds. Also, the feeling of transcending time and space, of emotional release via catharsis or heightened emotions, profound insights into personal issues and existential questions, vivid hallucinations, and enhanced creativity, among many other experiences. However, for many it was, and is, the sense of ego-dissolution, leading to a sense of oneness and deep interconnectedness that most closely resembled those states read about in Eastern spiritual texts. The feeling that we exist as separate individuals seems so natural and obvious that it seems beyond question. The concept of the ego in spiritual traditions, both East and West, often informs not only the journey to, but also the destination of, spiritual enlightenment. In Buddhism, the egoic self as anatta, or the self as emptiness, is a fundamental principle and understanding. Anatta, or the self as already empty, suggests that the self or ego is not a permanent nor an unchanging entity. The Buddha taught that the idea that the egoic self is permanent is the very source of suffering, as it leads to attachment and desire. Thus, practitioners are encouraged to recognize the transient or empty nature of the self. This insight is at the core of enlightenment or nirvana, as the dissolution of the egoic self necessarily leads to the end of craving and aversion, and thus the end of suffering. Advaita Vedanta, a school of Hindu philosophy and spiritual practices, identifies the ego as ahamkara, or the ego sense. Ahamkara is considered an essential aspect of human identity, but it is also seen as a barrier to understanding the real self, which is Brahman, or the ultimate reality. Advaita teaches that the ego is responsible for creating a sense of separation from the rest of the universe. The realization of non-duality, the oneness of Atman, the individual soul, and Brahman, ultimate reality, is central to achieving moksha, or enlightenment. It is important to note that enlightenment in Advaita Vedanta does not entail the destruction of the ego, but rather merely the recognition of its completely illusory nature. While there are many real differences between Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, they both share the view that the ego sense, whether seen as an empty or illusionary entity, is the primary barrier to spiritual realization. Shamanic rituals have long incorporated psychedelics as a doorway to spiritual understanding. Substances like ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms have played a central role. The role of these substances in shamanic practices extends well beyond their psychoactive effects. They are believed to facilitate communication with the spirit world, promote healing, and offer insights that are otherwise completely inaccessible. The altered states of consciousness induced by these psychedelics are often described as experiences of ego-dissolution, states of consciousness where the boundaries between self and others dissolve, leading to a sense of oneness with the entire universe. It is this particular experience, the dissolution of the egoic self, that is considered absolutely crucial within shamanistic practice. For it is this experience which is recognized as leading not only to spiritual wisdom, but also to deep bodily and emotional healing. As we have seen, Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta also point to this radical insight into the nature of self as absolutely necessary for liberation and enlightenment. However, in Buddhism, the dissolution of ego is achieved through mindful practices and meditation that focus on deepening one's understanding of the impermanence of self. While in Advaita Vedanta, self-inquiry and discernment are used to recognize the illusory nature of the individual ego, ahamkara, revealing the true self, Atman, as one with Brahman. Both these paths suggest a gradual approach to transcending the ego. On the other hand, shamanic practices using psychedelics most often lead to sudden, profound experiences of ego-dissolution. One might argue that the sudden and powerful experience of ego-dissolution brought on by the shamanistic use of psychedelics may prove to be transient and ultimately dependent on the continued use of substances, and that the gradual approach of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta may prove to be more permanent and sustainable. But is this true? Not necessarily. There are many reports, though fairly rare, of a mere single use of psychoactive substances having utterly life-changing effects that have even provoked awakening. Conversely, there have been many who have maintained a regular and disciplined spiritual practice without resort to psychedelics, who have achieved little in either radical insights into the nature of self or ego-dissolution. Is it possible that a combination of disciplined spiritual practice and the judicious use of psychoactive substances prove to be the royal road to the radical insight into the nature of self and ego-dissolution? While the use of psychedelics is not traditionally associated with Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta practices, there have been historical and modern instances where these substances intersect with these spiritual paths. In the modern context, particularly in Western societies where Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta have intersected with psychedelic culture, there has been a growing interest in the potential of psychedelics to catalyze ego-dissolution. In certain Buddhist circles, Particularly within the scope of American Buddhism, there have been discussions and explorations of the use of psychedelics as a potential means of accessing states of consciousness similar to those achieved through meditation. However, it's important to note that Buddhism does not endorse the use of psychedelics, nor intoxicants of any kind. Despite this, some practitioners have posited that, under controlled and mindful conditions, psychedelics could offer a glimpse into the nature of the mind and the illusion of the self. The use of psychedelics within Advaita Vedanta is even less prominent. Rather, Advaita Vedanta strongly suggests self-inquiry and radical understanding as the primary means to achieve the realization of the non-duality of Atman and Brahman. However, there is a small segment of contemporary spiritual seekers who integrate psychedelics into their exploration of Advaita Vedanta. One of the main drawbacks is that the use of psychedelics in Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta contexts is less embedded in a long-standing cultural tradition. In contrast, shamanic practices typically involve a community-oriented ceremonial approach with expert guidance from an experienced shaman, whereas psychedelic use in Buddhist and Advaita Vedanta-inspired explorations is at its best integrated with elements of contemporary Western psychotherapy. The use of psychedelics is not without potential pitfalls and limitations. One may risk developing a psychological dependence. The depth and profundity of the psychedelic experience can lead one to believe that these states are only available through psychedelic substances. Another well-recognized problem is the psychological risks. These substances can induce intense, unpredictable, and uncontrollable experiences. Thus, the importance of set, the mindset of the individual, and setting, the environment in which the experience takes place, are very important in reducing these risks. Negative experiences, often referred to as bad trips, can occur, leading to confusion, anxiety, and even long-term psychological distress. For these and other reasons, traditional spiritual paths like Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta strongly suggest achieving spiritual understanding and the dissolution of the ego far more gradually. Gradual ego-dissolution via disciplined practice, self-reflection, and ethical living. These practices are designed to cultivate a more stable development of awareness and understanding. A stable understanding that leads to lasting transformations in consciousness. Psychedelic experiences can, and very often do, offer penetrating glimpses of higher states of consciousness. However, it is absolutely necessary to have the tools and frameworks to integrate these insights into one's everyday life. Without a dedicated spiritual practice, these experiences can remain isolated and without a lasting impact. Therefore, psychedelics are perhaps best viewed, at best, as supplements to, rather than replacements for, the practices found within spiritual traditions. To understand the psychedelic experience and its relationship to awakening, we need to understand the nature of experience itself. Enlightenment is not an experience. Rather, enlightenment is the transcendence of experience. Simply put, it is the radical insight that there is no subject of experience. There never was a subject or receiver of experience, no matter how extraordinary or even ordinary the experience. When we begin spiritual life or practice, we are often instructed that we are not identical to our experience, but rather the observer of that experience. We recognize that we are the observer of our thoughts, emotions, and body sense. We are instructed that we are something separate from our thoughts, emotions, and body sense. Initially, this perspective can offer valuable understanding and clarity. We can often experience this perspective during psychedelic experience. That is, that we are the observer of thoughts, emotions, and body sense. This separate observer is sometimes identified as awareness, consciousness, or the sense I am. In other words, something distinct from what it observes or experiences. This can be helpful at the beginning. However, it is crucial to recognize that even these, awareness, consciousness, I amness, are constructs that obscure a deeper understanding. In fact, the very notion that there is a here, a receiver, of any description, of experience, of any kind, is utterly illusory. As we go beyond the notion of an observer, of a sense of a receiver of experience, we discover there is no observer of any kind, not awareness, not consciousness, not I-amness. There is only the observed. Our experience becomes radically simplified. Sound is sound without a listener. Thoughts are thoughts without a thinker. Sensations are just sensations without a feeler. It becomes very clear that the apparent observer is actually intrinsic to the phenomena themselves. For instance, on hearing a sound, it is clear not only that there is absolutely nothing listening, that there is only the sound, but also that the sound has absolutely no location. There is no here. Thus, there is no there. Both positions are recognized as illusions. This recognition of the observer's position as being utterly illusory gives way to nothingness, unbounded and undefined. We are relieved even of the extremely subtle contraction of being defined as awareness, consciousness, or I-amness. The boundary between observer and observed suddenly evaporates. There is no receiver of thoughts. There are only thoughts. The apparent receiver of thoughts is only another thought. There is only what is. There is only this. There is no receiver of this. There is only this. Once we understand that awakening is not the product of any experience, we can examine and understand the psychedelic experience and its relationship to awakening more closely. There are fundamentally three types of psychedelic experience. First, there can be extreme experiences, both ecstatic and horrific. The position of the one having these experiences is not questioned nor undermined. Second, there can be the experience of being separate from the experience, of being the untouched observer. What is often called in the spiritual traditions, the witness position. Third, there can be the complete extinguishment of the ego sense, or sense of separation, including the witness position. It is this third psychedelic experience that can often be the most revelatory and life-changing. However, maintaining the insights gained into the non-existence of the ego self can often be problematic. This can be because one of the first things that happens after such an experience is that one claims the experience as had or received by me. This leads to giving the psychedelic experience meaning, that is, meaning for me. What does it mean for my life and my spiritual journey? This undercuts the ego-extinguishing insight of the psychedelic experience, as the core of the insight was that there is no me. Thus, there can be no meaning to the experience. This marks the difference between psychedelic experience and awakening. It is the difference between experience and radical insight. Psychedelic experience tends to offer temporary ego extinguishment, while awakening by definition is permanent. Psychedelics can, and often do, provide experiences of ego-dissolution and even a sense of oneness with the universe. Spiritual traditions and practices such as Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, though not traditionally aligned with psychedelic use, share the pursuit of transcending egoic illusions for spiritual enlightenment. While psychedelics can catalyze insights into the illusory nature of the ego, it can be very difficult to maintain those sights beyond the initial experience without radical insight into the nature of self. Ultimately, real awakening transcends experiences, psychedelic or otherwise, as well as the very notion of an experiencing subject.
Tvameva bandhuscha sakha